Welcome back yet again. Today we're going to talk about Japan. In 1945, the United States, as I'm sure you know, dropped a couple, that is, two atomic bombs on Japan. This had a devastating effect. Arguably, a similarly profound effect was the fact that we dropped democracy on them that very same year. Japan was long a single-party state until very recently, and then we've had some changes yet again where that single party has come back. But it is a large country, 127 million people, and highly crammed. And we'll talk a little bit about the demographics in a couple minutes. This is the second largest economy in the world. Well, it was the second largest economy in the world. China actually passed it in 2010, so now it's the third. Perhaps it'll slip into fourth place soon. But there are very high levels of egalitarianism in Japan, thanks really to everyone starting from zero after World War II, plus the enormous economic growth that you had in the post-war period. Japan's overall real economic growth was about 10% on average in the 1960s, about 5% through the 1970s, and about 4% in the 1980s. By the end of the 1980s, you had the start of this period of stagnation. Japan had its own financial crisis, way before we had ours, based on, surprise, unrealistic asset values in terms of stocks and real estate. And then finally they started to pick up a bit earlier in the 2000s, and then the global financial crisis hit, and so they remain sort of mired in this troubling economic climate. In terms of the topographic map, I mentioned demographics. This really highlights this cultural vulnerability and dependence that's come about in Japan. People are living on a mountainous island. About 12% of the land on the main four islands is actually inhabitable, and about 80% of the people live in urban areas. So in terms of urbanization rates, still we're talking about less than the UK, which was at 90%, highest that we've talked about so far, but a very highly urbanized population, and just not a lot of places to go. About 3/4 of the food and almost all of Japan's fuel is actually imported. And that's why nuclear fuel is such an important source. So when we talk about Fukushima, the 2011 tsunami, it's really difficult to give up on nuclear fuel when everything else that you have has to be imported. So this is this cultural vulnerability and dependence. And you've got a history of isolation after centuries of attacks on Japan, centuries of attacks by the Chinese, by the Koreans, by the Mongolians, and you have lots of xenophobia. And of course, the West, right? The West came in the 19th century. But what you also have is, you also have an aging population and a declining workforce. Same sort of dynamics that you saw in Western Europe, which causes lots of problems. So women are highly unempowered. About 40% work. We have about 40% working in the United States. But again, with this aging population and a declining workforce, you need someone you need more people out there working to maintain the social safety net. And immigrants is one obvious choice. That's something we talked about with respect to France and the United States. A little bit less in the UK case. But in Japan, there's been a very anti-immigrant sort of policy. This is the most ethnically homogenous of the states that we're going to discuss, or that we've discussed to date. Yeah, that we're going to discuss. 95% Japanese. This is very rare and it's very important. 95% Japanese. This is, it's a country where you can almost talk about the nation state. And we know the difference between nation and state. There are ethnic minorities. There are the Ainu, the Okinawans, descendants of Koreans and Chinese and others. They tend to face discrimination. Okay? It's hard to become a citizen in Japan. You have to show that you become fully assimilated to gain citizenship. The mainstream norms and values are heavily influenced by Confucianism, as well as a history of bureaucracy and militarism, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. And then, of course, military defeat and forced democracy, the democracy that we pushed on them. So, I'm going to start with another slide. No, I won't. I'll just keep going. So, the evolution of Japan. So the US, the UK, France, the cases we've talked about so far, all developed politically with relatively little input from the outside. There were competitive pressures perhaps, but they developed their own mechanisms to deal with them internally. In Japan, outside influence has historically been critical to bringing or inspiring change. And then outside influences are adapted to sort of on-the-ground conditions. So we can start with the 3rd century, when you had this primitive state where hunters and rice gatherers were living under a chieftain that was passed through lineage. Right? So there weren't elections. Right? There's sort of emperor-like chieftain. By the 7th century, China comes into Japan, and it brings some important things: Buddhism, Confucianism, the written language. If you look at the Japanese characters, many of the Japanese and Chinese characters are the same for the same thing, but they're pronounced completely differently. The same character means car, but I say chan and you say bing. It sounded very Chinese and Japanese. Sorry. I studied Chinese for about a week. Never studied Japanese. The administrative system also came from China. They enacted land reforms. They created a taxation system that would finance this meritocratic bureaucracy. And this is really important. So you have a bureaucracy nearly from the get-go by the 7th century, thanks in part to China, that's based on this meritocracy. And gradually the bureaucracy becomes hereditary. It becomes supported by fewer and fewer funds because you have a declining tax base. And this is really the sort of the rise and then the gradual decline of the bureaucracy. But remember, that bureaucracy will come back, and we'll talk about that later. From the 8th to the 12th centuries, power and wealth go really from the central government to rural landowners with territorial nobles in charge, the Daimyo. So this is the rise of the Daimyo. These are the people who govern the lands that they occupy. Peasants serve essentially as serfs, and then you have samurai who are the warriors. But the daimyo is the wealthy class, and they become increasingly dissatisfied with rule, and this becomes a military aristocracy from the 13th to the 16th centuries. The emperor is really a puppet in the hands of the daimyo, who again are these rural nobles, and the strongest of these daimyos is the dominant lord, the shogun. The Tokugawa clan ruled over this feudal hierarchy in the name of the emperor, keeping the daimyo in check. The samurai, living with lords, gradually transformed themselves into civil officials, civil servants, essentially. You can imagine. Well, we'll make a comparison in a second. But these were highly efficient, very skilled, very disciplined, and very respected civil servants. So again, you have the rise again of this bureaucracy. At this point, society had evolved into a very rigid, hereditary, hierarchical system. So samurais were at the top, though also various levels. Then you had the peasants, and then you have the artisans and craftsmen, and finally you had the merchants at the bottom. Commercial activities were looked on with disdain. So we can begin to draw some parallels with Europe here. We've got a long history of monarchy, right? A strong civil service, like in France that we talked about, and a sort of feudalist system. Although with a bit of a role reversal, where the peasants are actually higher on the totem pole than the merchants. So a lot of this does remind one of feudalism, with the samurai, with the important role that the samurai really transforms itself into this bureaucracy. Well, by the 19th century, there's lots of discontent in Japan. At the very top, the samurais. You're talking about a group of people that had status but really lacked money. Lower down, well, at the very bottom, we can talk about the merchants who had money but they had no status. And finally, you've got the U.S. and the European arrival, which creates a legitimacy crisis for the Tokugawa rulers, who had to succumb to these very unfair trade demands. That's what Western imperialism is about. It's about pushing other states around. And this leads to discontent, and you have a revolt by junior samurai modernizers. This is known as the Meiji Restoration of 1867. This was spurred by anger to the West, but at the same time they wanted to emulate the West. And we've seen this when we talked about less developed countries, the role of nationalism. So a lot of the times, the same ideas from the West are transported to these countries where the populations reject Western influence, but actually grab at the ideas. The slogan behind the Meiji Restoration was "Rich country, strong military." So they centralized power, they threw the ruling lords out, They wanted to give land back to the peasants and drop the samurai privileges, which might sound surprising, given that this was samurai elites themselves. These are samurai modernizers, though. There's a belief that this was backwards. They demanded an imperial constitution, which provided for an emperor with power, but also a bicameral diet, the bicameral legislature known as the Diet. It didn't have much authority, but at least in name, this was a constitutional monarchy of sorts. So this is the first time we can talk about a constitutional monarchy in Japan. So the first constitution really dates back to the 19th century. The system really, though, was evolved around this cult of personality around the emperor, as well as national patriotism, which was fostered by the educational system in a lot of the same ways that we talked about non-democracies and cults of personalities are function today when we talked about non-democracies. One thing that the Meiji Restoration was effective in doing, though, is it strengthened the modern centralized bureaucracy, which was staffed by these ex-samurai who were really well respected. But they also relied on what's known as the zaibatsu. The zaibatsu are these large financial conglomerates. And this was the state-supported entrepreneurial class. So the samurai who are in this bureaucracy rely on they're ex-samurai now, they rely on the zaibatsu. And they use the military to go on this imperial rampage to feed the zaibatsu. And this is when you have the beginning of Japanese, no picture here for you. But this is the beginning of Japanese imperialism. They defeat Russia, they defeat China, Taiwan, Korea, all this before World War I even happens. Now, after World War I, the middle class demands greater rights and democracy. The peasants and the union leaders are making their own demands. And so the result is this Taisho democracy. And this should ring some bells. Where else do we see the middle class leading the fight for democracy? I'll just leave that question open. And you should think about that. And you should know some answers. So Taisho democracy dates from 1918 to 1931. It was a tough experiment. It was really thwarted by the global depression. You had labor unrest, popular anger against anti-Japanese sentiment abroad, especially in China. And this led to political polarization. It led to violence. It led to a regime that wasn't functional. And so what sort of regime do you get when democracy breeds chaos? That's right, a military regime. So naval cadets assassinate the democratic leader, and the military extends its control over the state. This is a period of enormous repression, ultra-nationalism, a cult of personality around the emperor, once again, and this very expansionist foreign policy. Before World War II, Japan is annexed Manchuria, aka Eastern China, in 1932. Then it invaded China proper in 1937. It attacked Pearl Harbor, obviously, in 1941, as well as Southeast Asia. It got Korea, Taiwan, Indochina, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, all this during World War II. And then finally, on September 2nd, 1945, it was defeated, with 4% of the population killed. So I'll end this right now, and we'll come right back to a similar slide in just a second.